There is a filing cabinet, not a metaphor, an actual cabinet, in a federal building in Washington where the documented history of millions of American families simply ends. Not trails off, ends. The records that should exist before 1870 for ordinary working families across 24 states are not lost, not misfiled, not waiting to be digitized. They were never created in any consistent form. The infrastructure to create them was available. The decision not to require them was deliberate. I found this while looking for something else entirely. What I found instead was the shape of an absence so precise it could only have been designed. I started with land deeds because land deeds don't lie in the way that other records can. They record transactions, boundaries, names of parties, dates of transfer. They are dry and precise and remarkably consistent across the 19th century. What they kept showing me, in county after county across the Ohio River Valley, and then further west into Indiana and Illinois, was a pattern I couldn't explain through normal record attrition. Families appeared in the 1870 federal census, fully formed. Parents in their 40s, children ranging from infants to teenagers, a household with apparent history, apparent roots, apparent continuity. And before 1870, in the deed records, in the local tax rolls, in whatever church registers had survived, almost nothing. Not the thinning you expect from older records. A wall. The 1850 and 1860 federal censuses exist. They are incomplete, uneven, and far less detailed than what came after, but they exist. For many of these families, they should have provided at least a thread, a name in a household, an age that would track forward, a state of birth that could anchor further research. What the 1850 and 1860 records showed instead, when they showed anything at all, were different names, different structures, different household configurations that didn't connect cleanly to the families that appeared so fully documented after 1870, as if two different populations had occupied the same geography and sequence. Consider the arithmetic. A man listed as 43 years old in the 1870 census was born in approximately 1827. He was a child during the 1830s, a young man during the 1840s, a father by the 1850s. His entire early life, his birth, his parents, his childhood county, his first marriage if he had one before the records begin, should be traceable. In regions with consistent record keeping, it is. In the specific geographic and demographic clusters I kept encountering, it isn't. Not because the records degraded, because the records were not created or were created in forms that were never centralized, never copied, never required to survive. The United States did not mandate civil registration of births, marriages, and deaths at the federal level in the 19th century. This is a fact most Americans don't know, because they assume that if the information exists somewhere, someone must have been collecting it systematically. Some states began voluntary vital registration in the 1840s. Massachusetts was the first, in 1842. But voluntary registration in a period of high internal migration, high immigrant arrival, and low institutional trust meant that registration rates in many counties ran below 30%. A family that moved once, from Pennsylvania to Ohio, from Ohio to Indiana, could fall through the gap between two incomplete systems and leave almost no recoverable trace. This is the official explanation, and it is reasonable, partially. The infrastructure was genuinely incomplete. The political will to standardize it did not arrive until after 1900, when most states finally enacted mandatory registration laws. Reasonable, except for one detail that kept surfacing the deeper I went into the county records. The incompleteness was not random. It clustered. Specific counties and specific states showed registration rates so low they were functionally zero, while neighboring counties in the same state, served by the same rough infrastructure, showed rates above 60%. The difference was not geography. It was not poverty. It tracked, with uncomfortable precision, against the populations that had arrived in those counties during a specific window, roughly 1854 to 1870. Sarah Grayson was enumerated in the 1880 census of Morgan County, Indiana, listed as 61 years old, born in Virginia, widow, keeping house. That put her birth at approximately 1819. She was old enough to have clear memories of the 1830s and 1840s, old enough to have watched the decade before the wall from the inside. A local historian in the 1930s, recorded a brief account she had apparently given to a church women's group sometime before her death, describing her arrival in Indiana as a young woman with, in her words, nothing on paper and no one who could say different. She did not elaborate. The historian did not ask her to. The account is 4 sentences long and sits in a County Historical Society folder that has not been digitized. She was not unusual. The WPA life histories collected between 1936 and 1940 contain dozens of similar asides, brief, almost incidental references by elderly Americans to the absence of their own documentation, not as a grievance, as a fact of life so ordinary it barely warranted explanation. They had arrived somewhere, they had built something, and the records of what came before had either not followed them, or had never existed in a form that could follow anyone. What the WPA writers recorded as background detail, as texture, as the ordinary friction of American life, was something else entirely when you read enough of them in sequence. It was a pattern, and patterns have sources. The question I kept returning to was not why the records were absent. Absence can be explained. Absence has a dozen reasonable causes available at any given moment in 19th century American administrative history. The question I kept returning to was why the absence had a shape, why it concentrated in specific counties, specific demographic groups, specific arrival windows, why it resolved so cleanly after 1870, as if someone had thrown a switch. The 1880 census is detailed. The 1880 census is consistent. The families that appear in it, with no recoverable past before 1870, are documented with the same thoroughness as families whose records run back to the colonial period. The machinery of documentation did not improve gradually. It arrived. The 1850 census was the first to list every member of a free household by name. Before that, the 1840 and earlier censuses recorded only the head of household by name, with other members tallied by age and sex brackets. This meant that for the majority of American families, the first federal record that named every individual in a household was 1850. A family that arrived anywhere in America after 1850 and before 1870 existed in a 20-year window when individual names were theoretically being recorded, but the systems for doing so were incomplete, inconsistent, and in many regions controlled entirely by local officials with no standardized reporting requirements. 20 years. The precise window during which the wall was built. In 1854, the Children's Aid Society of New York began placing children onto westbound trains. The program would eventually be called the Orphan Trains, though the name obscured more than it revealed. Charles Loring Brace, who founded the society in 1853, was explicit in his published writings about the goal. The children of the city's poor, Irish immigrants, German immigrants, the children of families broken by poverty and urban overcrowding, were to be relocated to rural communities where, in his framing, they could be remade. Clean air, honest labor, distance from the corrupting influences of their origins. What his published writings were less explicit about was the mechanism of that remaking. Upon arrival and receiving communities across Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and Kansas, older children were encouraged, and in many documented cases required, to release their previous names, their previous locations, their previous family connections. The Society's own records from the 1850s and 1860s are incomplete by design. Placement records were kept sporadically. Return addresses were not systematically recorded. A child placed in Morgan County, Indiana, in 1858 might appear in the 1870 census under a family name that bore no relationship to any name they had carried before. Between 1854 and 1870, approximately 50,000 children moved westward through this system. The full program would eventually transport an estimated 250,000. But the early decades, the decades that coincide precisely with the construction of the wall, account for a disproportionate share of the demographic disruption in the receiving counties. These were not children without histories. They were children whose histories had been institutionally severed at the point of placement by organizations that kept poor records, in a period when no external system existed to cross-reference what had been lost. The simultaneity is what resists easy explanation. The Children's Aid Society begins systematic westward placement in 1854. The recording gap in receiving counties begins clustering in the same decade. The 1860 census, taken 6 years into the program, shows the wall already forming in the specific counties and townships that served as primary placement destinations. This was not infrastructure lag propagating slowly through an uneven system. This was infrastructure absence in the places where a specific population was arriving, with no documents and no institutional memory of where they had come from. The reasonable explanation is that undocumented children became undocumented adults who raised undocumented families. Reasonable, except that the wall's edges are too clean. Counties immediately adjacent to heavy placement zones, receiving similar immigrant populations through normal migration channels, show normal registration rates. The disruption is localized with a precision that pure accident does not produce. Reverend Elias Strom, a Methodist circuit preacher who worked placement communities in central Indiana throughout the 1860s, kept a private journal that was donated to a theological library in Indianapolis in 1931. He recorded, in an entry dated March 1863, that he had attempted to locate the original family records of 7 children recently placed in his circuit, and had been told by the Society's regional agent that such records, where they existed, were held in New York and were not made available to receiving communities. He noted this without apparent alarm. It was, by 1863, simply how the system worked. The records existed somewhere, in a form controlled by a single organization, in a city most of these children would never return to. Not coincidence. Structure. Then, October 8, 1871, the fires did not begin in Chicago. They began, as best as contemporary accounts can reconstruct, across a geography so wide that the Chicago fire, catastrophic as it was, represented only one node of a single night's destruction. In Peshtigo, Wisconsin, a firestorm consumed the entire town in approximately 1 hour. Somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 people died. The fire burned 1.2 million acres. Survivors described conditions that do not match normal wildfire behavior. Flames that moved faster than a running adult. A heat so extreme that people crossing open ground ignited without contact with visible fire. Winds strong enough to lift adults from their feet. The same night, Holland, Michigan burned. Manistee, Michigan burned. Port Huron was threatened. Across an area exceeding 2 million acres, fires erupted in the same evening hours across 3 states simultaneously. The National Weather Service acknowledges the simultaneity. The official explanation, drought conditions, accumulated lumber debris, a cold front driving high winds, accounts for the scale of individual fires. It does not account for the timing. A cold front produces fire risk across a wide region. It does not ignite multiple discrete locations at the same hour across 3 states. In 1883, a researcher proposed that fragments of Biela's comet, which had been observed breaking apart in 1846 and was expected to return in 1872, had struck the atmosphere and ignited the fires from above. The theory was investigated again in 2004 by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Witnesses in Chicago reported blue flames burning in basements, a color consistent with chemical combustion outside the normal range of wood fires. The theory has never been proven. It has also never been disproven. What burned in 1871 was not only buildings. County courthouses in 3 states held whatever local records existed for the communities in their jurisdictions. Birth registers, marriage records, deed books, naturalization papers. The courthouse in Chicago's Cook County lost records dating to the city's incorporation. The courthouse in Peshtigo's Marinette County was gone entirely. In Holland, Michigan, the entire civic infrastructure of a community that had been receiving immigrant settlers for 2 decades was reduced in a single night to nothing recoverable. The families who had arrived in those communities in the 1850s and 1860s with incomplete documentation arrived in the 1870s with none. The wall did not appear after 1871. It deepened. The records that might have partially reconstructed the previous 2 decades of arrival and settlement were gone, and no copies existed because the systems that would have required copies had not yet been built. This is the sequence that resists dismissal when you lay it flat. The Children's Aid Society begins systematic placement of undocumented children into receiving communities in 1854. The recording gap begins forming in those communities in the same decade. The 1860 census captures the wall in early formation. The 1871 fires destroy courthouse records across the precise geography of heaviest placement activity. The 1880 census documents the resulting population with no recoverable past, in detail so thorough it forecloses further questions. Each step is explicable in isolation: a philanthropic organization with poor record-keeping, an infrastructure gap in a young nation's administrative systems, a catastrophic weather event striking drought-stressed timber country. Together, they form something harder to dismiss than any one of them alone. Not coincidence, sequence. And sequence, when it produces the same outcome through 3 different mechanisms across 17 years, is a pattern. In 1890, the federal government conducted its most ambitious census. For the first time, each household received an individual schedule. The census recorded immigration status, naturalization details, years of residence, home ownership, Civil War service. It was the first enumeration detailed enough to have answered, definitively, the questions the previous 4 decades had left open. Where had these families come from? When had they arrived? What, if anything, connected the undocumented populations of the placement counties to the children who had been shipped westward from New York, beginning in 1854? The 1890 census was also the first in American history for which the government broke from a century of protocol and did not require duplicate copies to be filed in local offices. Every previous census from 1790 to 1880 had local backups in county courthouses and state archives. The 1890 census existed in one location, the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in that basement. Approximately 25% of the records were destroyed outright. Another 50% suffered serious water and smoke damage. The investigation never determined a definitive cause. For 12 years following the fire, the surviving records sat in a warehouse. No restoration effort, no attempt to copy or preserve what remained. Then in December 1932, the chief clerk of the Bureau of the Census sent the Librarian of Congress a list of documents scheduled for destruction. The 1890 census was on that list. The librarian was asked to identify any records worth preserving for historical purposes. He identified none. Congress authorized destruction on February 21, 1933. The next day, February 22nd, President Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building, the fireproof facility created specifically to prevent exactly this kind of loss. They destroyed the records 1 day before beginning construction of the building that would have saved them. Of 62.9 million names, roughly 6,160 survive. Fire, neglect, bureaucratic process, authorized destruction, each step plausible on its own. Together, they eliminated the single record that would have documented every American alive during the transition, including the 250,000 children relocated by the orphan trains, including the families who appeared fully formed in 1880 with no recoverable past, including every person who had lived through whatever the 1850s and 1860s actually contained, and might have said so if anyone had thought to ask them before the asking became impossible. Not coincidence, pattern. The 1854 placements begin. The 1860 census shows the wall forming. The 1871 fires destroy the local records. The 1880 census documents the resulting population without questioning its origins. The 1890 census captures the last people who could have answered the questions. The 1921 fire damages those records. The 1933 order destroys what remains. The 1936 WPA project interviews the last witnesses. It is defunded 3 years later. There was a woman, there had to have been, in every county touched by this sequence. A woman born in the early 1840s, living past 90, sitting in a house in the 1930s, surrounded by grandchildren who had grown up hearing pieces of her story. She would have been a child in the 1850s, old enough by the 1860s to understand what was happening around her. Old enough to remember a world in which the people arriving in her community had names that didn't match the names they were using, pasts that didn't match the pasts they described, a before that nobody asked about and nobody offered. She would have watched the courthouse burn in 1871 and understood, with the clarity that comes from having seen the thing the building was supposed to document, exactly what had been lost. Not the building, the record of the people. the proof that they had existed in a particular form before the transition remade them into something more legible, more placeable, more permanently separated from whatever they had been. When she tried to tell her grandchildren what she remembered, they nodded and changed the subject. Her memories didn't match the textbooks, and in the America of the 1930s and 1940s, the textbooks always won. What did she remember about the children who arrived on the trains? What did she know about the names that changed at the county line? What had her own parents told her about the decade before the wall, the families who came through with nothing on paper and no one who could say different? Those questions were never asked by the WPA writers who came to her door. The writers were looking for pioneer stories, Civil War memories, tales of hardship and perseverance. They were not looking for the specific shape of an absence. They recorded 2,900 interviews across 24 states, and then the program was defunded, and the remaining 24 states were never covered. And the woman in every county grew older, and her grandchildren grew up, and the oral chain connecting living memory to whatever existed before the transition grew thinner with every decade, until it was nearly gone. Her grandchildren are in their 80s and 90s now, the last human links to first-hand accounts of what the period before the wall actually contained. The Library of Congress still holds those 2,900 transcriptions, typed and handwritten by Depression-era government workers, searchable and publicly available since the 1970s. Has anyone read every one of them, looking for the detail that doesn't fit? For the aside that contradicts the official sequence? For the moment when an elderly American, born before the wall was built, said something to a government writer in 1937 that the writer typed faithfully without understanding what they were recording? The documents are there. The archive does not forget, not even when everyone alive has agreed to. The families had a past before 1870. The past had a shape. And somewhere in those transcriptions, in the careful handwriting of people who were only trying to do their jobs, the shape is still waiting for someone willing to look at it directly, instead of accepting the silence that was built, carefully and in sequence, to replace it.